So you start from the beginning and work your way to the right. And there's a little book called Ruth. Right after, if you find the book of Judges, you will find Ruth. All right. So when you open up your Bible, what's the first book in the Bible? Genesis. Okay, so you've got 5 books there that are called the books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They're called the law. They contain not just the 10 commandments, but a set of rules and laws, just like we have here in Ireland, called the Constitution. That was Israel's constitution. It is called the law. But after Deuteronomy, there are 2 more books. Remember them? They are Joshua and then Judges. And then comes a little book, as I just directed your attention to it. The little book is called Ruth. Now, every book in our Bible, every book is about the Messiah. It's about Jesus. Sometimes a book in the Bible would describe his first coming. Sometimes a book will describe his second coming. There'll be prophecies about his victorious coming. Sometimes it'll be about his coming to suffer. Sometimes it describes why he is coming. And that's where the book of Ruth comes in, because the book of Ruth contains the gospel. It contains good news. It describes the reasons for the coming of the Messiah. It is part, the time that Ruth is written is a part of a path that God is working through to bring the Messiah into the world. Ruth is not a Jewess. She's a Gentile woman who was, for all practical purposes, pagan. She was without God, without hope in the world. And yet, she amazingly gets into the very genealogy, the lineage of the Messiah. And she gets in there by being the great-great-grandmother of David. I want to show you, I know you're in Ruth, I had you go there first, but hold this place, go to the right, find Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1. Matthew, the first book of the New Testament. Matthew chapter 1. You're at a good point tonight where you're actually at the start of a study through the book of Ruth. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background before we start verse by verse. Matthew chapter 1 verse 1 says the book of the generation of who? Who is it? Is Jesus Christ. Okay, so we all have a genealogy. I can tell you about my mother and father, about my grandparents on my mother's side, my grandparents on my father's side. We can go back in time. Well, here's Jesus' genealogy. It says, the son of David, the son all the way back of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren. And Judas begat Phares and Zara of Tamar. And Phares begat Ezram, and Ezram begat Aram, and Aram begat Abinadab, and Abinadab begat Naasson, and Naasson begat Salmon. You say, what are all these names? They're people in the lineage. Watch this. Now we come to verse 5, and Salmon begat Boaz of Rahab, and Boaz begat Obed of who? Of who? Of Ruth, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David the king. So it goes on, David begets Solomon all the way down, and it goes all the way down to, if you don't mind, let's just get down here, all the way down to 16. And Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. So let's go to Ruth, and I want us to read the first 5 verses. I'm going to talk us through those 5 verses, and then we'll be done for tonight. All right, Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. And she was left and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab, and the name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. Here's our key name here. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman, Naomi, was left of her 2 sons and her husband. So, just from the start, let's go back to verse 1, and I want you to see it was the time of the judges. It says, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. So was there a time when Israel had kings, yes or no? Yeah, who was the first king of Israel? Anybody remember that? Raise your hand. King Saul. Now, he wasn't really that much of a great of a king. Name another king of Israel. Okay, David. He was a pretty good king. Any other ones? Solomon. Who else? Rehoboam. Okay, so there were lots of kings. But before the kings, there were men and one woman who were judges. This was about this book is written about 1000 BC, so 1000 years before the coming of the Messiah. And it was before King Saul or King David or Solomon ever lived. It was at a time when Israel was a theocracy. You know what a monarchy is, don't you? A monarchy is where there's a king ruling. Well, before the kings ruled, God ruled. Theos, God. Theocracy means God's rule. So God started off Israel under just him, and they failed. They didn't do very well under just him and going by the law. So God had to have judges or people who would lead and would protect and would influence Israel. Moses was the first kind of ruler of Israel, though he was not a king, followed by Joshua, and then there were 15 men and one woman who guided Israel to live by the laws of God, and actually would lead them in battle against their enemies, because, you know, when you're kind of aimless and you have no leadership, enemies take advantage of you, and the enemies surrounded Israel still to this day, try to take advantage of the land. And so tell me if you recognize, if you actually remember this name, okay? Othniel. Does anybody remember Othniel? He was a judge. How about Ehud? That was a judge. How about Shamgar? Who was that? What about Deborah? She was a judge. Gideon. Anybody remember Gideon? Then there was Abimelech, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan. Do you know there's a guy named Ibzan who was a judge? Elon, Abdon. How about Samson? Anybody remember that guy? Big, strong guy. Eli and Samuel. These were people who were supposed to keep the nation of Israel doing the right thing, having like Ireland's supposed to live by a constitution. They keep wanting to change it every couple of years. But that constitution for Israel was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they constantly had to deliver Israel from the consequences of the rebellion from God, because Israel would go away from God and ignore his laws. And so another nation would come in and oppress them, and God would raise up a judge like Samson who would defeat their enemy and restore them back to God. But it ends, look at if you're in Ruth, if you have one page back, look at chapter 21 and verse 25 of the book of Judges now. Judges chapter 21 and verse 25. In those days, just before the book of Ruth was written, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in whose eyes? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? What do we call it when everybody does what they want? Anarchy? Well, free will, yeah, but chaos. Can you imagine? Have you ever seen some of the countries? India has probably gotten better, but I remember watching a video of driving in New Delhi, India. And they did not obey any rules. The cars and the little carts and the buses were in all lanes, traveling in all directions. It was mad. I understand it's like that still in the Philippines. I don't know. But aren't you glad for some rules of the road? So when everybody does what they feel is what they want to do, it is deadly. And that was the time that Ruth is written. But it wasn't just a time where everybody was doing their own thing. Look again in verse 1. It says, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a what? All right, there's a famine in the land. So a famine is a harsh drought. You know, what they say that there's climate change. The climate's always changing. Ireland has had droughts before, hasn't it? And had famines. The climate is constantly changing. Now everybody wants to blame man and get rid of the cars. Actually, if you ever listen real close to the what they call what do they call the people who are into protecting the climate and everything, they really want to get rid of humans because we're to blame for everything. But climate's always been changing, and you get droughts and you get floods and stuff. And that's part of life. So a famine is a harsh drought condition, and it was happening throughout the Canaan land where the Jews were living, the promised land. And people were not getting enough food to eat. Now, what would you do if the shelves in one shop were empty? You'd quickly run to another shop, wouldn't you? And if there's no food there, where would you go? You'd go further to go find food, wouldn't you? Now, I don't think any of us have really ever had a hard time trying to find food. We may have had a hard time trying to find nappies. We may have had a hard time finding a certain brand. But we've pretty well done well. We've never experienced a famine, have we? But if you had to experience a famine, how far would you move to go to find food? That's what's driving this story here. People were in serious danger of starving. There were no government programs. And this guy, I want you to see his name, verse 2. The name of the man, we'll come back to him in a second, was Elimelech. Elimelech has debts. Everybody had crops. And if you're a farmer, this is how it operates. You have, say, 100 acres. And you have seed, or at least what you think is enough seed to plant those acres. And everybody has debt. And so what you do is you buy sufficient seed. If you don't have enough, you buy sufficient seed to plant your crops, to pay for your current bills, and to get you ahead so that next year you can borrow money to buy more seed, to plant, to raise the crops, to sell, and you have this what's called short-term debt. Farmers get good at it. They go into debt and then they pay it off, and they go into debt and they pay it off. Well, when you have a famine, you don't get a crop and you can't pay off your debt. So Elimelech's being driven to do something because debt is mounting, his family's starving. What's he going to do? Well, we call them economic migrants, where they move because of war or because the economy that they're at is bad, and they come to Ireland because the economy is good here. And that's what everybody's starting to do. And it pushes one family specifically into the nearby country called Moab. So if you remember, you got Abraham. Abraham had a nephew named Lot. And Lot was not a really good guy. And Lot had two daughters, and they each had a son. And one of the sons was Amnon, the other one was Moab. Now, Moab never sought God. The people of Moab were right across from the Dead Sea, across the Jordan River, and they hated the Israelites. There was such war between Moab and Israel. It's kind of like North and South Korea. It was really, really bad. They were pagan, and they hated God's people. They often fought with the Israelites. They would come in and try to take land, and they worshiped the worst gods you can imagine. If you were a Moabite, you worshiped a god named Molech. And Molech was the all-supreme god of the world to the Moabites. You know what Molech required of people? To sacrifice their babies in a fire. Now, this is absolutely gruesome. It is absolutely unheard of to understand this, but this was the culture, and when you read the Bible, you go, wow, that's rough. It's because of how dark the world was, and God was bringing light into it. He didn't eradicate all of the darkness. He brought light into it, and God's laws were good because how dark people were. So Molech was a god that had this cow-shaped, bull-shaped head, and had a hand sticking out made out of brass and a belly made of brass, and they would stoke the belly with coals of fire, heat up this brass figure of the god Molech until he glowed because he was so hot. And his hands were stretched out, and people, in order to get a good crop, would bring an infant, their infant, and would place it into that hand and instantly incinerate it. Because Chemosh and Molech and Ashtart, the goddesses and stuff that were parts of that religion, demanded a sacrifice. Funny how all the other gods demand you to sacrifice, where God says, I'll be the sacrifice. Isn't that awesome? I'm glad I serve a God who died for me instead of me requiring me to die for him. So that was the kind of religion, culture that this family's going into. How would you feel going into a culture that didn't value, especially infant life? They valued their crops and their belly more than they valued their children. So this was the beginning of the book of Ruth. Elimelech, if you look, hears that the famine's not so bad across in Moab. Read again in verse 1. It says, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. This was in verse 2, and the name of that man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi. And I hope you circle the word Naomi, because that's a very special name we're going to look at. And the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. They were from, like we'd say, I'm from, the north side, or, I'm from Clonakilty, I'm from Clon. Well, Ephrathah was a little area that's now known as Bethlehem. And this is unique in that it was a single family that God points out, and he says, I'm just going to, out of all the people that are leaving Israel and going hither and there out of stress and out of desperation to find food, I'm going to watch this one family, and God begins to record what's going on in their lives. And I want to say this. What was happening was actually part of a plan of God that was going to bring about everything so that Ruth would get saved. There was a famine that was going to drive a family out of Israel into a foreign land. They were going to have disaster after disaster so that Ruth would learn about the God of heaven. You ever think about that? This is absolutely, if I give you nothing else tonight, it is that the things that go on around us that seem to affect us and seem to discourage us and cause us to figure, I guess God is against me. He's not against you. He's just not doing things for you at that moment. He's working out a bigger plan for someone else that's just as important as you, but at that moment, he's working on them. Another example is when Caesar Augustus ordered a tax over all the world. And in order to pay the tax, Rome forced everyone to go to their hometown where they were born. And all of that was to force a man and a very pregnant woman to leave Nazareth and go on a horse and ride 60 miles south to Bethlehem so that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. So why did the world get taxed? Why was everybody so angry at Caesar for taxing them some more? They can be angry all they want. God was moving one family down to Bethlehem to make sure that Jesus was born in Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy. So you understand, one of the greatest things to understand is when the world is in a hurricane around you, God's doing something. It may not be for you at that moment, but it's for someone else. And it may be you next. So just trust the Lord. Just sit back and go, God is awesome. He's doing something. And this book is not written about Elimelech. Notice it's not the book of Elimelech, is it? It's not the book of Naomi. It's the book of Ruth. It's about trying to get Ruth into the kingdom of God. So here's a single family. And God lists their names. And I want to say Elimelech, his name means my God is king. That's a good thing. At that point, they had no king, so Elimelech, he grew up being taught by his parents, your king is God Almighty. That's who you obey. That's who rules your life. And isn't that a good thing? Naomi, does anybody know what her name means? It's a wonderful name. What do you think it means, Jason? Say again? No, not Naomi. You're thinking of Eve. Eve means the mother of us all. But Naomi means pleasant, sweet. Now you'll find out as we go into Ruth, and as everything falls apart around her, she loses her husband, then she loses her 2 sons. She's away from Israel. She has nothing but debt back in Israel. You know what she says? Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me bitter. She doesn't like her name. And so this is actually going to be very, very helpful, because we're going to relate to different people in this event like maybe never before. So Naomi, her name means pleasant or sweet. Mahlon, her firstborn, she called him Mahlon, which means sickly. I wonder, how would you feel growing up being called, sickly? But that's what his name means. Killian's no better. Killian means pining, which means weaker and weaker. I don't think she thought that they would live. This is the kind of, when she has these 2 boys, she's got problems. We have across the road here, we have the Down syndrome group. And my heart goes out to them as moms and dads bring their children in, and they're trying to give them a normal life, and they're trying to teach them, and they're doing such a great job. But think about the amount of time it takes in raising and helping children who aren't quite exactly like the rest of us. Think about somebody who's constantly sick. So Naomi's not got a perfect home. They've had to leave home, and her children are weak and sickly. This is not the mightiest and the healthiest and the most royal family. This is the most desperate kind of family. We're still in verse 1, and there's so much in here. I want to just draw out a word here. It says, now it came to pass, verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled, that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to, and the next word is sojourn. You hear the word journey, sojourn? All right, so they're not moving. They're not selling the house in Israel, in Judah, and then moving to Moab. What are they doing? They're just going to go into Moab, get some work on a farm, save a bit of money, then go back, and when the famine's over, get going again. That was their plan. We all have plans. This was a trip of about 80 miles. It wasn't like 400 miles away. It was only 80 miles away. It'd take you 4 days walking to get where they ended up, and they set up home. But just think about how they lived. You know what that meant when they went to Moab? They were at the bottom of society. They were outcasts. They were the enemies. And so at every queue, they were at the back. When everything was going, if there were any government programs, if there was any help, they were the last to get it. So they are in a hard situation, but it's better than dying under the famine. But verse 2 tells us something. Verse 2 says, and the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, and they came into the country of Moab, and they, what's the next 2 words? Oh, what does that mean? They stayed too long. Now, I don't know why, but they didn't just go make a bit of money, pay off their bills, and then go home. They continued there. They stayed too long. Look at the consequences. Verse 3, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. He's dying away from home. He's dying away from his family. They're away from where they should be. And she was left, and now she's got her 2 sickly sons. And they took them wives. Okay, so they're old enough now to get married, and they went ahead. But who'd they get wives from? They didn't get wives from Israel, which is what they were supposed to do. We'll talk about that in a minute. They fell in love with their girls where they lived. They lived and grew up, and they fell in love with the Moabite girls. And their names were not Oprah. Do you see Oprah there? It's not Oprah, it's Orpah. I always wonder where Oprah, I see it's on, Orpha, how do you say it now? I just messed up. Oprah Winfrey. I don't always wonder where she got her name from. But anyway, this is Orpah. And the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelled there. They weren't sojourning anymore, were they? How long did they live there? 10 years. And during that time, Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. So evidently they stopped planning on returning home. And I'm going to be kind of practical here for a minute. It's like when we have to work on Sundays. And there are times where you have to work on Sunday. It's like where you're busy and you just say, I'm not going to read my Bible today. I'm not going to pray today. You say, I understand. You get busy. The kids are rushing out. You're late for getting up to school, or you're late to get to work. And so you can't do what you know you should do. And when you start stepping away from where you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to be doing, isn't it harder to get back the longer you are away? And the longer you are away, the longer you stay away. So we call it being backslidden. You ever heard that phrase? Backslidden is a phrase that means instead of going forward, if you're riding a bike, well, let's not use that illustration, but if you start to go back, it's never good. But this is where they were in the promised land. They were in the midst of God's people. It got hard, and they stepped out. They didn't know what else to do, and now they stayed out. Is that a good thing? No, it wasn't wrong maybe for them to leave. I have no idea. I'm not in his shoes. I know this. When I am in people's shoes, it sure makes me realize how hard their decision was when maybe they had to step away and go do something. But when they stay away and they never come back, that's bad. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, while they were out of the promised land and out of the will of God, things went from bad to worse. Elimelech dies. So who is Elimelech? He's the one who held everything together. He was husband and dad, breadwinner. He was a family leader, and he was gone. Think about Naomi having to bury her husband in a foreign land. Naomi is without a husband. She's without a source of income. She is what we call a widow indeed. She has nothing. There's no welfare for her. She's going to be poor and die unless something happens. And I don't know why, but she doesn't go home. When her husband dies, why doesn't she go home? I don't know. But watch. When she didn't go back to Israel and stayed there, her sons married pagans, people who didn't believe in God, people who didn't want to be godly or anything. And her family is going down the tubes. Now, Orpah means gazelle. Means she was fast. So I'm not sure what that means. I mean, maybe she did the dishes fast. Maybe she, made the beds fast. Maybe she cooked fast. I don't know. But her name means gazelle. Ruth, her name means friend. Wouldn't it be nice to have a good name? When people thought of T-Road, they think, he's a great guy. That'd be a great challenge, brother. When you said Ruth, it meant a friend. Now, these were the only girls around to marry. They were all Moabites. There were no other Jews, evidently. Or these sons had grown up thinking, why would I marry a Jewess when I got these beautiful girls? And the truth is, you will fall in love with the culture of the people you live with. That's why you make sure you're around people who love God. You can't just fall in love and get married to the first person who winks at you. I can tell you story after story of people who got married to somebody or moved in with somebody because they said they loved them, and then they found out it was not spelled L-O-V-E, it was spelled L-U-S-T. These guys didn't know what they were getting into. They just jumped in and just married these 2 girls. And this was not a good thing. Israelite men and women were supposed to marry people from their same culture, their same faith, and not intermarry with the other cultures or religions. Not because God is a racist, but because God says, you got a culture here that I want you to protect. Solomon, he did break the rule, and he just married every girl. Remember, how many wives did this king of Israel, how many did he collect? By the way, we use the word collect. How many wives did he collect? 700. 3,000. 700, which is still just as much as impossible. Bill keeps asking, how many birthdays did he have to remember every day? 700 wives. And so many of them were from other countries and other cultures and worshiped other gods. And he arrogantly thought it would never affect him, and it did. It turned him away from God. It really ruined his life. He was stupid as for being the wisest man ever. Go to Deuteronomy. You're in Ruth. Go back to the left, find Deuteronomy. And chapter 7. So when you go from Ruth, you're going through Judges, and then you'll pass Joshua going left, and then you'll hit Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 3. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 3. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them, people who are of other cultures and other countries. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take to thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, this is God talking, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and will destroy thee suddenly. Go to another scripture. You can hold your place here in Ruth, and go to the right. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians, if you can find that. 2 Corinthians in the New Testament, chapter 6, in verse 14. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 in verse 14 says, be not unequally yoked together with who? All right, now, this was not saying that an Irish could not marry a French or a German or an American. No, it's saying don't marry unbelievers. Doesn't it say that? Because that's putting two people in a yoke that would always go in different directions. Would it be wise to put a bull and a mule in a yoke? Would it be? No. The bull will go this way. The mule will just sit there. You've got to put two of the same kind in that yoke. And it says, be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Why? For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? When you're saved, you're light. Somebody's not saved, they're darkness. Righteousness with unrighteousness. It just doesn't mix. So this was the rule, that you don't go and marry the Moabites or the Ammonites or the Hittites or the termites or the flashlights. You'll get that joke someday. They are going ahead and disregarding God's law. And 10 years pass, and in those 10 years, both of those sons now die. Now, I would say that that's too soon. These sons are these are maybe 20-year-old sons. And they're gone. So the husband's gone too soon. The two sons are gone too soon. They have no children. They have no property. They just died. And so Naomi has lost everything. Think about what she's lost. She's lost her husband, her sons, her potential grandchildren. She is totally alone now. She's still in debt, as we'll find out as we go on in the book. She's living in a foreign land, speaking a foreign language. She's away from God. She's out of God's will. She's away from God's people. She's scared. She's defeated. She feels like a failure, I guarantee you, because that's what we're going to read when we see her in a little bit. And she's got two Moabite widow girls looking to her for, what are we going to do? And she's like, I don't know. And she can only come to this one conclusion, and we'll read it in a couple of weeks. God is against me. That's how she feels. Now, you would feel it too. I can understand completely. That's why we can relate to the people in the Bible, because they're real. And she will say, God is against me. He's catching up with me and my sins and my failures, and I did wrong, and this is what's happening to me. And let me tell you, that's how the book begins. You say, that's terrible. No, that's great. Because that's where we are. Most people don't live from success to success to success. Most people live struggling. And we desperately need to know, is God in charge or is fate? Is this trouble just going to happen, or is God working things out for good? I'll just quote it to you. Psalm 72:18 says this. Blessed be the Lord God, the God of Israel, who only doeth wondrous things. That's all. God, somebody says, well, can't God do any better? No, God can't do any better. He only does the best. He only does wondrous, wonderful things. Romans 8:28 says this, we know that all things, I love that, all things work together for good to them that just love God. Not to those who are perfect, but to them who love God and who are the called according to his purpose. Naomi is about to discover just how amazing God's grace is towards her and even towards Ruth. So what you and I are going through is called life. Nod your head. You say, God's against me. No, trouble, hurt, that's life. And the things that are happening around us often, yes, are consequences of wrong decisions. Yes, you can be reaping for your sin. Yes, you made wrong choices. Every one of us are sometimes living in the results of the sins of our parents and even our grandparents sometimes. But none of that matters when you're a believer. When you're following Jesus Christ, you're part of God. God moves you into his plan, and he always does something wonderful in your life. You say, well, I sure wish you would give me money. That's not the wondrous things that God does. Don't measure God's goodness by money. Measure God's goodness by the ability to go to sleep at night. By having kids who love you and love God, and having a wife who stays with you, having a husband who stays with you and loves God and is a servant in the home instead of a bully. Can you not stand back and go, God blesses in better ways than just money? So the things that are happening to us, usually trouble happening to us, may just be for someone else to be blessed, and that's okay. It all depends upon the will of God and the timing of God, so try and not backslide. That's number one. Would you write this down in your head? Try and not backslide, all right? If you do backslide, get back right with God as fast as possible. If you have the tendency to step away and not go to church for a while, or not read your Bible for a while, or not pray, and you just seem to always go back to the old habit of just sitting for hours watching TV and never tending to your own family, never caring about your wife, if those are your tendencies, realize it's going to bring about consequences. So if you ever backslide, go, man, I better read Ruth and find out, is it worth it? And it's not worth it. And say, I better get back to church. I better get back right with God. I better get my heart right. And start to believe Romans 8:28, that God's going to work everything out for good. You say, I've gone so far away from God. You're only one step. You know how far it takes to get right with God? That's all you have to do to get right with God. Turn your heart back to him. And he's not a million miles away. He's right there waiting for you to say, I'm sorry. Please accept me as I am. Start over with me. And God says, done. You don't have to walk 1,000 miles to get back to God. All you have to do is turn your heart back to him, and he's right there. So that's the beginning of the book of Ruth. Have I whet your appetite? Is it going to be good? I think it's going to be awesome. We're going to see the gospel in it. It's going to be super cool. All right, Bill, you're up.